The Straits Times Weekly Issues from the 1st of June, 1887, reported the proceedings of the Marine Court of Inquiry against Captain Harrison of the Fair Penang. The witness was Mate Farquharson of the Benton. Quote, cross-examination continued. I cannot say that if we continued on our respective courses, we should have passed without collision. We were meeting end on. I cannot say if the other ship was a little to our side or another. No one, when he sees the three lights of a steamer, is allowed to do otherwise than take it that she is coming on right ahead.
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story? Delayed aid for the Benton.
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Benton had started life in 1872 at the J&G Thompson shipyard of Glasgow. The small single-screw steamship was only 340 tons. Though she originally carried the name Leon, she was eventually acquired by Lee Keng Yong of Singapore and had her name changed to the Benton. Here, she was put on a route between Singapore, Penang, and Malacca, carrying passengers and cargo. It was noted by one person who took passage on her that she was overcrowded and overladen, though that was not unusual for ships of the time on the same route, and it was nothing that would have caused alarm among those boarding her. As the Benton departed from Malacca, bound for Singapore on the 29th of March, 1887, she had on board a cargo of tin as well as an estimated 100 passengers. It was difficult to determine the exact passenger count, however, due to the habit of selling tickets on board the ship up to departure. Considering the size of the vessel, the description of the past passenger of people being packed on the deck to the extent that he had to step over them seems to have been accurate. There was also no complete count of the number of crew members on board. The only people who were named were the officers, including Captain Miles, the captain of the Benton. The route to Singapore was well traveled, and the Benton would have contact with multiple familiar ships on her voyage. Captain Roselles of the Sissi reported that his ship was coming from the Muar River, also headed for Singapore, at about 7 in the evening, when he had seen the Benton going down the river at a much greater speed than they were traveling. They were soon out of sight. The Chaofia, which was headed from Singapore to Malacca, traveled past the Benton, going in the opposite direction at midnight near Batu, Pahat. It was a clear and calm night, allowing the vessels to see and identify one another clearly. At about half an hour past midnight, with the Chaofia well on her way and out of sight, the crew on board the Benton saw the red and green lights of another steamship up ahead. The steamship, which some of the people on board the Benton believed to be larger than their ship, had 2 funnels as well as a mast, and seemed to be on a collision course with them. The Benton turned her helm to port, but the oncoming vessel did not seem to change her course at all. Before the Benton could do anything else maneuver out of the ship's way, they struck, with the Benton sustaining damage on her starboard aft of the boilers. Almost as soon as the 2 vessels had struck, the other ship disappeared into the darkness, despite the mate shouting at her to stand by, and a sailor who was traveling as a passenger took it upon himself to repeatedly sound the ship's whistle as a sign they needed aid. No one on board could tell if she had sunk or if she had just continued on her voyage. No one on board the Benton had any doubt the ship had been fatally damaged and was in a sinking condition. The panic on board the crowded Benton was immediate, with some people wanting to jump overboard immediately, but Mate Farquharson prevented them. There was some hope that the ship that had struck them might turn back and offer them aid, but in the meantime, it was the intention of the crew to find a good place to run the ship to shore. To this purpose, Captain Miles, Chief Engineer Cooper, and Mate Farquharson all gathered on the bridge to try to calm the passengers, while Second Engineer Ancient remained below to try to get as much speed as possible from the engines, so they might make it to the shore. As it became more and more clear that running the ship ashore was most likely not going to happen, attention turned to the 4 boats that the Benton carried. An attempt was made to launch them, but the panicked passengers made this impossible. All 4 boats were capsized by a rush of people, and the people who were in them were thrown into the water. Mate Farquharson claimed that if everyone had remained calm, most of them would have been able to fit in these boats and escaped unscathed. Some of the people were lost when the boats capsized, but most of them were pulled back onto the Benton, where they were at least temporarily safe, though the ship was sinking beneath their feet. As it became more and more clear that things were reaching their end, Captain Miles bid goodbye to all of his officers, showing no interest in putting much effort into saving himself. Accounts varied between it being a quarter of an hour or 45 minutes after the collision, but the Benton went down stern first. With it went almost all of the women and children who had been sheltering in the saloon when the ship had taken her sudden plunge. In the chaos, it was hard to tell who else was in the water, struggling, and who had simply gone down with the ship. The land was 6 miles away, and there was no sign of any ship nearby to come to their aid. The Benton had been carrying many lifebuoys, and some of these floated on the surface, as did 3 of the capsized boats. A group of 16 men managed to right the 2 boats and got into them, giving them some safety. Meanwhile, everyone else clung to any wreckage that was floating on the water. Second Engineer Ancient clung to a plank. Mate Farquharson and 3 other men ended up clinging to a piece of wood that Mate Farquharson had put through a lifebuoy, and then tied into place to make it a flotation device large enough for all of them. At one point, Mate Farquharson and his companions tried to right the 3rd boat that was floating capsized in the water. But since it was a whaler, it was too large and heavy for him to flip right side up, and he had to give up. The Sissy arrived on the scene at around 3 in the morning and found 16 men who had righted the capsized boats. This was the first time that anyone in the outside world had learned that there had been an accident. Since the survivors had all drifted apart, the 16 men, only one of whom was a member of Benton's crew, could not say whether or not there were any other survivors. The crew of the Sissy said that they had looked around in the darkness, but that they had not seen anyone else, and they continued on their course to Singapore to give the news of the sinking of the Benton. With a lack of experienced sailors among the men, and with most of the passengers asleep when the accident occurred, the account that the survivors gave on their arrival in Singapore was a confused one, with one man even saying that he believed the ship had struck a rock and that had caused her to sink, not even realizing that they had been in a collision with another ship. More clarity would come soon. The survivors who remained in the water saw multiple vessels pass by. Some of them passed too far to hear them, but others seemed so close it was as though they were taunting them. The Cecil C. Smith was specifically called out as having passed so close by that it seemed impossible that they had missed the cries of those in the water, but it did not slow down. One of the ships, which the people in the water reported seeing stop for about 20 minutes, was almost certainly the Sissy, but they did not notice the people in the water in the darkness. The next day, things got even worse, with the smooth and calm seas turning choppy. The survivors who did manage to stay close together all tried to help one another stay afloat, as the day passed and darkness fell again, with still no promise of help. When the Sissy arrived in Singapore and reported to the owners what had happened to the Benton, the owners dispatched the Pontianak to try to search for survivors. The Sissy arrived at 3 in the afternoon, and the Pontianak departed at 5, so it was a swift turnaround. On board the Pontianak was the brother of one of the passengers who was determined to help search for his missing sibling. Fortunately for him, his brother was one of the men who was clinging to the piece of wood with Mate Farquharson. At midnight, the government lighthouse steamship, the Horsburgh, also departed to search for survivors. No one at that point held out hope, though the Sea Belle arrived and reported having seen nothing, even though she had passed through the area. The only comfort was that she had not known that she should be looking. It was around 1 in the morning, approximately 24 hours after the sinking of the Benton, that the steamship Will of the Wisp, under the command of Captain Dorff, arrived in the area. Captain Dorff had a good reputation in the community for never passing by anyone he saw in distress. The first people that the crew of the Will of the Wisp saw were the first mate and his companions, still clinging to the piece of wood. All night, the Will of the Wisp remained where she had found the first mate, stopping her engines completely. 2 boats were dispatched to search for survivors, going out in all directions and returning when they found someone. The people who were pulled from the water were exhausted from the ordeal, and it was agreed they most likely could not have held on much longer. Captain Dorff and his crew were ready to receive them with fresh clothes, hot coffee, and some brandy as they came aboard, and the men were slowly restored. In total, 25 men were saved in this way. At daylight, the Pontianak arrived, and the 2 ships steamed back and forth until noon, picking up several more survivors in the process. When the Will of the Wisp headed to Singapore, leaving the Pontianak to continue her search. 5 more survivors would eventually be brought to Singapore on board the Pontianak. There would be 4 other survivors no one expected. The sailor passenger who had blown the ship's whistle to try to get help had found himself a place on board a little sampan that had been on the Benton. In the company of the sampan's owner and 2 other men, they paddled ashore and waited until the morning. The next morning, they had managed to signal a small passing vessel, and the sailor had paid them $10 to take them to Singapore, where they arrived around the same time that the Will of the Wisp did. The loss of life was hard to determine, but it was estimated to have been over 100. It was therefore not surprising that there was a strong desire to determine which ship should be held responsible for the disaster. There were 4 ships that were suggested as potential candidates, and slowly they were ruled out. One of them had taken the outside passage, and had not taken a course that would have encountered the Benton. 2 others, including the Chaufia, were sighted by other ships passing ahead of the Benton, and therefore were not the culprit. Finally, the Fair Penang arrived in Muar, suffering from a large amount of damage to her bow. Part of her stern was twisted to one side, and there were pieces of plank still jammed into her forepeak. She was the 4th and final candidate for having been the other ship in the collision. The Fair Penang, owned by a man named Ban Hin, was an even smaller vessel than the Benton. She was only 101 tons, and did not even have a mate. She was under the command of Captain Harrison, who was well known in the region, having previously commanded the Chaufia. Mate Farquharson had just as good reputation, though, and the men were about equally matched when it came to credibility. It was therefore for the courts to decide when Captain Harrison insisted that the change in the Benton's course had been the reason for the collision. Faced with charges of failing to render assistance as required by law, Captain Harrison was forced to post a $5,000 bond until that court date came. Captain Harrison would argue that he had turned his ship toward the shore after the collision, not continued on his previous course, out of fear that his own ship was in sinking condition. He considered his first duty to be towards his own ship, and the Benton had disappeared quickly. He had assumed they had continued on their way. He made no statement referencing the distress calls of the Benton's steam whistle. The crew of the Fair Penang had panicked after the collision and had rushed to the deck saying they were taking on water, and this proved to be the case, though they were able to patch the holes with clay and build a temporary wooden bulkhead, which had kept them afloat. They had then gone to Muar, where, 2 days after the collision, Captain Harrison swore a statement reporting the collision before sailing back to Singapore. He insisted that he would have never sailed the ship to Singapore if he had realized the dangerous condition his ship was in, but that he had not realized the extent of the damage until they had properly inspected it on his arrival. In the end, the courts decided against Captain Harrison, finding that not only had he failed to obey the rules of the road, but that he had also failed to render aid when his ship had not actually been in sinking condition. He lost his master's certificate as a result. Captain Harrison filed an appeal, and a subscription was taken up to help him with his legal fees. The names of over 20 captains of regional ships were among the subscribers, including the captain of the Will-o'-the-Wisp and the captain of the Chaufia, suggesting that Captain Harrison had, if nothing else, the support of his community. They were to be disappointed. The appeals court found that there were no grounds for an appeal, that the original court of inquiry had cited the laws properly, and that Captain Harrison was simply in the wrong. His largest fault, in the public eye and the eyes of the court, was failing to turn back to save lives. For more information, please see the Penang Gazette and Straits Chronicle from the 5th of April, 1887, or see our other sources in the description below. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.